Welcome to the Tabletop Gaming Magazine podcast. I'm Chris Eckert, the editor of the magazine, and today we're going to join a conversation with Chris McDowall, the creator of Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd. We talk about Chris's approach to making games, which is mostly breaking them or taking things out. We talk about his new 10mm war game, which we've been watching him stream for a little bit, and we're also going to get his top 5 tips for making games generally, making RPGs mostly. Okay, here we go.
I'm not so much a game designer, so much as like a game demolisher, really. Like, I've settled into this now. This is just my thing. I just take existing games and break them to bits.
That's it. Yeah, that's really good. Well, I think that's probably like quite a good place to start, isn't it?
It's a niche.
Yeah. But like as a games demolisher, because I think one of the first streams that caught my eye was you doing. You were reclassifying Bastionland, Electric Bastionland.
Yeah.
So, what possessed you to? Why do you go down this route of just smashing things up?
Yeah. So that was kind of like an experiment because with Electric Bastionland, everyone seems to like the whole idea of the failed careers, like where you get like I like to think like an interesting kind of starting point for your character. And you get like some flavor, but I wanted to see if you could expand those into like something more like a class that you could progress through. So this was kind of like putting rules back on where I'd previously taken them off. So this was like kind of a bit of a reverse of that. But yeah, I think I've been doing the streams for about a year now, probably just over a year, and it seems that the things that people like are those kind of weird experiments a little bit. Like I'll tend to get more views if I do something that's very kind of prescriptive, and it's like, here's like building a dungeon, or here is ranking some D&D monsters. Like that if I wanted to be chasing numbers, I'd be doing more stuff like that. But the thing that actually gets people talking to me seems to be these weird experiments, and I think, yeah, people quite like seeing like behind the curtain of like creativity, if that didn't sound quite so pretentious, but like the sort of slightly informal process of like, well, how do you actually come up with some of this stuff? And the fact is, a lot of it is from doing weird experiments like this. Like, I think every game that I've ever done has started out as a weird experiment and then turned into, an actual thing, or just gotten abandoned, depending on how well it's gone.
I mean, because Electric Bastionland is just I say just. That's very rude of me. It's
just a rehash.
It's a rehash of Into the Odd, isn't it?
Yeah. It was basically it's the book that I wanted to happen after Into the Odd, which it sounds very obvious, but after Into the Odd, I kind of felt like the obvious thing to do would have been to release like a supplement book for that, but it started out as being a supplement, and then because the rules were so short, I thought, well, it'd be criminal for me to be selling this 300-page book and not include the 2 pages of rules that you need to actually play the game. So I'm like, I've got to put the rules in there. And then from there, that was an experiment as well, because I originally just thought, well, could I do these failed careers where each 2-page spread is like a single background for your character, and then the idea of doing 100 was just a challenge to myself, really, like making it 100. And then the idea that, well, if I'm making all these pages that are going to have 100 different careers, I need to make that worthwhile to people that aren't using those pages. Like, there's no point me saying you use these 2 pages and then you can rip out those 98 pages and you won't touch them again. So yeah, the idea of like having the setting be presented through those pages kind of evolved from there. So yeah, it is kind of like a weird natural process, really.
Yeah, I think you're saying there, because it all makes so much sense to me now, especially seeing your streams where you've said it was a challenge to do 100 of them, kind of.
Yeah.
Like you may as well have said, I'm going to do this all at once, on stream for 4 days. And that would make perfect sense to me. But yeah, I mean, I suppose we should tell people at home what Electric Bastionland is.
Yeah, so Electric Bastionland is a very rules light role playing game, where you are a group of characters that have come into a massive shared debt, and all you have is a failed career behind you. And your failed career will tell you about this world that this is all happening in, which is this electric Bastionland setting. So you're probably going to be from the city of Bastion, which is like this kind of early 20th century, not quite real city, like a sort of infinitely large, sort of weird urban fantasy sort of style, I guess, is the kind of the genre. So yeah, the idea with the book was that I wanted to make something that had incredibly light rules, but still had a lot of flavor and a lot of content in there. Because that was something that I always wanted, because I love these big books that you can kind of get lost in. But I don't want to read like big paragraphs, and I don't have to worry about lots of rules that you have to refer to in play. But yeah, that's a roundabout description of what Electric Bastionland is.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, and also, I mean, the reason we're talking now is partly because I think we're up to nearly an anniversary of its release. Is that right?
Yeah. So the Kickstarter was in November 2019, and so yeah, we started. I think the books were shipping about now. That they were just starting to go out.
And I remember it was the early lockdown, first time round, and it was lovely and sunny. And we were going to the park after work every day with my daughter. Yeah. And I would take whatever RPG book I'd been sent that week. But I kept taking Electric Bastionland because each character just gives you so much in terms of how you can like imagine that world. But I think you said to me that you haven't actually got it together with a group of real people yet.
No, I've not. I've never sat down at a table and opened this book to run it. I've played it online with people, obviously during the lockdown, and I don't think I've even, because occasionally I'll play like a one-on-one game with my partner, who obviously is the only person I've been able to really see like properly this last year. But I don't think we've actually done that together because we've been doing other things. So yeah, I feel like it's going to be weird the first time I actually sit down with friends and say, because we kind of played it when we were testing it, and before it was a real physical book, and they've seen various very rough prototype books and folders and stuff come out. But yeah, it'll be a weird feeling to bring it out when it's simultaneously old to me in some ways, because it's been like a year since it's been out. But it's going to be like dusting it off again, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we're hoping to do that. All of us are hoping to do that very soon. We've also got the review coming in the following issue.
Ah, cool.
So everyone can see what Richard Johnson Parks thinks of it.
Lovely.
But we all know it's good already. So, yeah. So let's come back to the streams and let's talk about making games.
Yeah.
Because the reason I reached out to you originally is because this time isn't just because I like Electric Bastionland. I want to give it some love. It was obviously. I think we can all agree that it was maybe unlucky to come out in the same year as Morkborg in terms of winning lots of awards.
That's always the problem, yeah.
Because obviously that's a bit of a darling, isn't it? So yeah, but they just decided that you're sitting down and you are exposing that raw way of creating games. Because you sit down and the dungeon making one, it was paint. You had paint, and you had what you refer to as advanced WordPad or notepad.
Advanced notepad. Yeah.
Advanced notepad. And that's it. And that's how games are made, apparently. And I think for a lot of people at home, it feels like a semi-mythical, magical thing for people to be doing this, and then watching you do it on stream, and it to be as legitimate as the things that are printed and that I enjoy, and sparking the same ideas in my head. Obviously, it's because you're very talented, but it's just sort of like eye-opening to do that. So, could you just talk about like that weirdly, I'm going to say lo-fi process?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it kind of comes from two places. So I didn't originally plan on necessarily doing like a regular weekly stream, but it just so happened that the exact to the week that I went self-employed as a full-time game designer, that week was the week that lockdown started. Well, it was actually I was due to finish my previous job, which was in the wine industry, and I ended up finishing that a week early because that was the day of lockdown. And they kind of said to me, look, there's no point you coming into the office for the last week, like when you're literally leaving and you've wrapped everything up. Like, so, finish a week early, basically. So I had a week off thinking, what am I going to do? And then I thought, right, I'm going to start in earnest. And it was the idea of the stream. I had originally planned on doing sort of a deep dive into the book in podcast form as like a stretch goal, because that's something I've seen other books do, and I've always really enjoyed listening to like the process behind the book. But I thought, well, let's try doing a video as well. And I thought I'll just do this as a one-off thing, see if I can get the stream to work, because I'm not especially technologically astute really with new stuff like streaming. The fact that I called it new stuff tells you everything you need to know. So I thought I'd do it as a bit of an experiment, but then I think it became a little bit of an outlet for not being like working in an office and not being able to, because I had all these plans of like I was going to go to co-working spaces and I was going to like sort of meet up and chat with other like people that are doing this and other people that are working for themselves. But obviously I was just kind of at home with my partner who was very busy with her job. And yeah, it became a bit of an outlet where it was nice to have that connection with the people that were watching and to feel like you were being heard and to have people asking you questions like live. And yeah, the lo-fi thing started as just, that was as much hi-fi as I could manage, to be honest with you. It wasn't necessarily lo-fi by design. It was sort of lo-fi by necessity, based on my computer setup. But then I think as I carried on doing it, I did start to think, well, maybe this is quite good, because so much of the online presence of RPGs nowadays is based around very glossy, very professional stuff. I mean, the elephant in the room is like Critical Role, but even if you look for sort of any kind of D&D based video on YouTube, like you've got people with like all these like flashy things, and it's all very YouTube and very, very like engaging. So I thought we need something less engaging. So I thought, well, I can't really do that. That's not really what I want to do. So I did
just to say, your videos are really engaging. That's the thing.
Yeah. I'm being quite self-deprecating, which is kind of the theme with the videos. But yeah, I wanted to do it in a different way. So I thought, well, let's go with this and let's just be kind of open and transparent and say, look, I'm going to try and do this experiment. It might not work. I'm just going to talk you through how I do it. And just make it kind of honest and authentic, rather than trying to fit into what is already considered like what a video has to be online nowadays, if you get what I mean. And yeah, it's been fun. So yeah, each week now I just kind of take things 1 week at a time, and I try and sort of follow my muse, if you like, and go with what's inspired me on that week, which takes you to some interesting places for sure.
So I really like the dungeon making one for things like so for those who haven't seen the video, you sit down and you've got a map of a dungeon with some rooms that have got numbers on them, and then you have a WordPad open that has a list of numbers.
Yeah.
And you start by just giving them all names like Spooky Room, and
yeah,
and things like that, which start off as like almost silly. I think you kind of make jokes about it, don't you?
Yeah, or at least very basic ideas. So like, yeah, the Spooky Room is a good one.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could talk about that idea of just like throwing something at the page like that, and how, because it all came together really quickly.
It's the whole idea of like the tyranny of the blank page, I think they call it, like where like it's the starting from the beginning of something is like the hardest thing in the world on like a blank page. So I've kind of, the way that I like to do things, I kind of think of it more like sculpting, where you need to put a load of clay down and it doesn't look like anything yet, but it's there. And then you can sort of chip away at it. And the idea is in there somewhere. You've just got to like chip away, rather than sort of starting with a blank canvas and having to paint very thoughtfully each piece. So yeah, the way that this idea works is, like you say, to use like the dungeon that I just did. I think for like the random encounters, there were 6 random encounters. So you start with like skeleton, and then zombie for number 2, and then like ghost for number 3. So very kind of prosaic, basic ideas. And then when you've done all 6, you go back to the start and add an unexpected thing to it. So I think we had like skeleton undertakers or something.
Yeah.
And then
like, Banshee's having a party.
Yeah, so we had Banshee, and then it's like, well, there's no point taking Banshee and then adding like screaming Banshee, because that's already like assumed.
Yes.
So you need to add a twist to it. So we had like it was like a Banshee party. It was like celebratory Banshees, like they were celebrating a death rather than mourning a death. And yeah, that kind of process for me, it does mean you often end up with things that are like, you definitely end up with things that are like twists on classics, I guess. So if you want something super serious, it's probably not an amazing system, but if you're willing to have some like weird stuff in there, but yeah, you keep adding these ideas until it's weird enough, basically.
Yeah, I think you also said on that stream something like you make all the monsters. You make it very easy for people to be empathetic with the monsters.
Yeah, and again, that's not by design. That's kind of a flaw, really, because the amount of times I've run a game and it's just like players walking through a sad dungeon, like being sad at all these monsters. So I now know that I have to course correct, because that's my default. So you have to make sure that there's some reason why they might come into conflict with these monsters, and that's the other thing that I try and get across on the stream is like, this is what I do for me. But it's not so much me saying this is the perfect system for everybody. It's me saying like I've arrived at these systems because I know what my sort of strengths and weaknesses are when I'm creating a dungeon or writing a game. So yeah, if there's one thing I want to encourage people to do, it's to sort of really reflect on themselves and like reflect on what they feel they are good at and what they want to lean in on, and especially what things they need to course correct on. Like I joke that I always forget to put treasure in a dungeon, and I've done so many games where the players have wandered around this dungeon, then I've looked around and I thought, I've not actually put anything good in here at all. This really is just a terrible experience. And now I know better, and that's why there's like a whole page of it in Electric Bastionland saying like, put treasure in your dungeon.
Yeah,
it's for me as much as anybody else.
Yeah, I think when we originally spoke about Electric Bastionland, you mentioned there's the idea of getting players to be, or GMs at least, to be more creative through the process of using the book. And I think that came out in that idea of similar to creating dungeons, I suppose, but the way you suggest people kind of make a tube map of a place.
Yeah, definitely. And that was the big difference between. So when I was looking at this book after I'd published Into the Odd through Lost Pages Publishing, then I sort of thought, well, I don't want to just do it again but bigger. I do want this to be different. And one of the things was that Into the Odd was kind of self-contained in the sense that it had like a starter adventure, and it had some guidance for like making your own monsters, but it was very, very small, and it was basically kind of like an all-in-one package that you could just run, which was very useful. But I wanted this. I deliberately didn't include a sort of starter adventure in this because I wanted everyone to be able to create their own thing straight off, and I wanted to get the GMs being creative like immediately. Which is, it's kind of like pushing you in the deep end a little bit, but there's quite a large section of it's quite a slim section of procedures really for how to actually prepare your first game. Everything from put some treasure in there, and here's how you create some treasure, right through to, like you say, the whole tube map system, which is designed to be very quick. And I've done example videos of all them, and even with me kind of talking through it, I was able to create like an entire borough of the city in an hour, or an entire section of deep country in an hour. So yeah, it's the whole like teach somebody to fish idea rather than giving them fish. That's what I've sort of gone for with this book, definitely.
And also I think we also spoke about, and I think this goes with the creating sympathetic but slightly sort of tweaked monsters, which is the making magical items.
Yeah.
Thing. I think because all of the weird objects, the oddities, they are the oddities, aren't they?
Oddities, yeah.
Yeah, in Bastionland there. They're all just quite strange objects, and they're all kind of designed to break the game, I feel.
Yeah, and they were very much sort of, the inspiration for them was in I keep referring to D&D. I think the game has ended up quite a good distance away from D&D, but it kind of started out originally as kind of like a hack of like basic D&D and kind of moved on from there. But the thing that I always liked about magic in D&D is when you get those things like the portable hole and the like immovable rod, and almost things that you don't need to say anything else. Like if I tell you this is an immovable rod, if you've never played D&D before, you might have to ask like, well, how does it work? And you say, well, you push this button and then it becomes immovable. But that's all you need to know. You don't need to know that you need to roll a save against this score or it does this much damage. It kind of does what it does. And I always liked those ideas because it does break the game. And you always hear these horror stories on like message boards about people saying like, oh, well, we created this, we created a nuclear bomb in D&D by putting the bag of holding inside the portable hole or whatever and dropping it from an eagle. And like people say that's like that's bad if you're trying to like create the next serious fantasy epic. But in a game like Electric Bastion, where there is kind of a little bit of innate silliness to it, it's kind of like a dark humor really. I don't mind things like that, so I kind of really lent into it. So yeah, there's lots of items that just do the gold standard I was aiming for was something where you could tell what it did by its name almost. That was kind of the
mechanically expresses what it does just by naming it.
Yeah, exactly. Like even if and again the thing that I always think about is if you imagine talking to a friend who doesn't play RPGs necessarily, and they sort of say, oh, what did you do last night? And you say, oh, played a role-playing game. And I want to create things that happen that you could tell to that person and they would find it entertaining. So it's not a case of, oh yeah, last night I unlocked the improved grapple ability, so I was able to immobilize this monster. So they'll stop listening. But if you say like, oh yeah, I'm looking through some of the items now to see if I can find something that's gonna. Oh, here we go. So the first thing I found is one of the items you can start with is a crawling hand that follows basic instructions and has a bad attitude. So yeah, you could say, oh, my character, they found this hand that follows them around, but they've got a bad attitude. Like that's gonna give them something where they're like, oh, okay, I understand that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know what's going on there immediately.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. That kind of that's actually like an accessibility argument, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, and I wanted to have all those things because most of these, well, in fact, all of these oddities are really inside these failed careers that you can roll. So they're all kind of there that you could end up with them when you roll up a new character. So your level 1 character might get like the example I always use is like a portal gun. There's kind of like an equivalent in Electric Bastionland, and your starter character might have a portal gun, or they might just have like a broken stethoscope. It's kind of like the look of the draw. But I didn't want to bury the lead. I wanted to have these things in there straight away, and it does mean that you're probably not going to run an Electric Bastion campaign for like 6 years, like gradually working your way up the power levels. It does kind of throw stuff at you a lot more quickly than that. But I think that kind of speaks to my impatience and sort of the way that I enjoy these kind of games, really.
Yeah. I personally appreciate that. That's how I like to play these things.
Yeah.
So one of the other things you've been doing on stream, which is sort of I feel it's like a deviation, just because of how I know you. But you've been making a war game.
Yeah, so weirdly over the last year, I've actually ended up making 2 war games. so I for the last year I've been working on like a 28mm like skirmish game. That's in quite a good place now, and it's hopefully something I'm going to be putting out at some point in the next year or so. But yeah, that kind of started when I got back into miniatures, which was something that I was very into miniatures when I was like between about 10 and 15. And then I kind of dropped off and just got more role-playing games with my thing after that. And then obviously during the lockdown, as so many people did, I kind of thought I'll buy a little pack of miniatures as a gift to myself for my birthday and some paints, and I'll do this because I've got loads of time now. So I'll just get back into it. And then before you know it, you've got loads of stuff. And obviously I couldn't just play a game that already existed. So I thought, well, I'll make my own game. So I did that. And then this year, as my kind of equivalent to that, it was almost like exactly a year after I'd sort of got back into miniatures. I was like, I'm at a pretty happy place with where my 28mm stuff is, and I thought what I really miss is those kind of big battles. Because when I got into miniatures originally, it was with Warhammer Fantasy battles, where it was like big blocks of regiments, and you were kind of pushing them and wheeling them around. But there's no way that I'm painting like 100 rat men like ever again. Like I didn't do a good job of it when I was 11. And I would say I'm less patient now than I was when I was a child, probably. So I enjoy painting miniatures one or two at a time, but I didn't want to do that. So I kind of stumbled onto 10mm scale, which
I think is a mysterious scale.
It is. Like I knew about obviously 28mm being like the big standard, really, and then I knew about sort of 6mm epic scale from when Games Workshop kind of dabbled in that. And yeah, 10mm is obviously being relatively close to 6, but like a little bit bigger. I kind of stumbled onto that, and the main appeal was that I could buy an entire like 30-man regiment for like £6.
Nice.
And like and base them all up, and I was like, they're so small, people won't be able to see my awful painting.
How do you paint them? I assume you just paint those by just getting a spray can and just doing one colour and then another colour on top for the hats.
You do get some little. I was surprised. I was simultaneously surprised how much detail I was able to pick out, but I also found it a lot harder than I thought I was going to, because I thought I could just dry brush and washes on and hope for the best, but it doesn't quite work because the detail isn't as fine as like some of like these plastic 28mm
you can't
W things. With them, you can just rely on the you can like rely on the texture of the miniature to help you out a lot. And you know, it kind of, I'm not saying it paints itself, but the way that I paint them, they do kind of paint themselves. Lots of dry brushing and washes.
I'm absolutely with you there.
But then these little ones, they're a little bit more. It sounds bad, but they're a little bit more like old school blobby metal miniatures with like less defined features. So they take a little bit more work. But yeah, I've only painted one base up because I need to get back. I've got one half done now. So I got one finished and then another half done. But I thought, I wanted to see if I could create a very, very simple game that would let me push blocks of miniatures around in 10mm scale on a relatively sensibly sized board for like a regular table. So I did what I always do, which is see how many rules I can remove from like existing games and see how much I can kind of strip things back.
I mean, are you allowed to tell us where you started?
I kind of started with there is a book called 1 Hour War Games by, I want to say, Neil Thomas. I may be getting that name wrong. It's on my shelf. Bear with me. Yes, it is Neil Thomas. So Neil Thomas, 1 Hour War Games. And that book was what inspired me, really, because his whole idea was to see if he could create war games that would play on I think it was like 2x2 foot table.
Right, okay. Quite small.
Maybe actually, no, I think it was 3x3 foot maybe. But yeah, small enough that you could fit on a normal table. With it will play in an hour, and rules that fit on, it's like this sized sort of digest sized book, and the rules fit on like 3 pages, and that's all of the rules. And then he takes that same core rules and rewrites it for 9 different eras throughout history. So the first rule set is like an ancients, like classical era rule set. And for each one, there's only 4 different unit types. So he has to really, and then it's an interesting book because he like really goes into the detail of how he explained why, for say medieval period, what the few little changes he made to the rules and the units to make it feel more like that era. And I liked that whole approach, and I thought I did try that out, but it was a little bit. Weirdly, I did feel like it needed like a few more rules, if anything, which is like the opposite of what I said. So I've kind of added in places and subtracted from other places because I wanted to make it a bit more quick and impactful, because that game is very much like slam your blocks together and flank, and then you kind of grind each other down a little bit. Whereas I wanted things to be a little bit more chaotic.
Yes. You talk about like power spikes, don't you?
Yeah, and just like it's kind of it's that balance between order and chaos, where you want things to be predictable to some extent, but then you want like a weird spike to happen where something unpredictable happens, and getting that balance right is kind of key. Joseph McCulloch, who wrote Frostgrave, has spoken about this a lot, where his game uses like a D20, which everyone shouts at him about and says, "Oh, you shouldn't use a D20 because it's too swingy," and like, it's too much of a variation. And I've heard him so many times say that like that's the point That's what he wanted. He wanted like that chance that like your attack dog might kill this armored knight in like one random thing. Because like, yeah, that's what people remember. Like when you're playing these kind of games, like if I want to play chess, I'll play chess. Like I want something where there's always at least the risk that something crazy is going to happen. So yeah, it's just called Project 10 at the minute, and it's a good example of something where I kind of started working on it, and I felt like guilty about talking about it because I was like, well, people that are reading my blog and people that are watching my stream, they don't care about this. But weirdly, like whenever I do talk about these little weird side projects, someone will come out and say, oh, this looks kind of cool. And like they're in a similar position to me where it's like, I've always fancied going back to miniatures. But then I've seen that you've done this really simple game, so I'm gonna dip in and give it a go. And so yeah, now I've just decided that any stupid idea I have, I am going to talk about it because people now know that that's what they're getting when they when they do my stream or go on the blog. But yeah, that game's in kind of its early stages. It's stalled until I get around to painting up the rest of my 10mm army. But then hopefully I can meet up with some friends and at some point in the next few months and actually give it a try on the table.
A lot of us are in this position of coming back like to miniatures in some way.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I don't know, it just seems like something that I hear a lot of.
I think it's completely different than, I mean, at the risk of sounding like an old man, when I was getting into miniatures when I was like 10, it was like the thing that, you know, a few other like weird kids at school were into. And, you know, you would buy White Dwarf and look at the stuff that was in there, and you would occasionally go to a Games Workshop. But there was I never really felt like it was a part of any kind of, I hesitate to use the word community, but like it didn't feel like you were a part of anything and like there was any kind of social element to it other than like your existing friends. But now one of the things that I think has kept me going is I have like an Instagram feed that is entirely people's miniatures that they've painted, because it feels like such a wholesome community, because it's generally just people posting pictures of miniatures and then other people saying like, yeah, that looks great. And then whenever I do one, this is really vain. This is like, I feel like a proper like Instagram influencer. Whenever I finish painting a miniature, the first thing I do is like take a photo of it. And I've got like a WhatsApp group with some of my friends who used to paint, and I'm always like, send it to them. And then I send it to the Discord server that I'm in that talks about miniatures, and then put it on Instagram. And it's just kind of, and it's not so much me saying like, oh, look at this amazing top of the range miniature, but it works both ways. It's kind of like we're all kind of sharing our work together, and especially considering we can't play each other at the moment, really, I think it's taken on this much more like the craft side of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even at a very basic level that I'm working at, it's a lot of fun just like sharing what you're doing with people, and just like knowing that at the same time that I'm painting, like one of my mates will text me and say, oh, I'm going to go and crack out the paints too, and it's just a nice feeling, really.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And also the fact that you get such positive responses for these sort of things, because I've done exactly that. Just said,
yeah,
you know, painted this rat or whatever
it
is. You know,
touch wood, I've only really seen positive stuff so far.
Yeah.
No one comes on Instagram and says, oh mate, you need to work on your detailing around the eyes. Like, I don't touch wood. I'm sure they're out there, but I think I've cultivated my social media presence hopefully enough that they don't see me.
So I think one thing we could segue into nicely here, by mentioning a segue, is our top 5 tips, because we've been talking about making games and all that sort of thing, and I asked you to bring me your top 5 tips for making some games.
So I thought about this throughout the week, and I sort of got this down to 5.
How many? Of course, you're going to remove them.
Oh yeah,
this was your top 10 rules, and you're going to remove 5 of them. Of course, that makes sense. Yeah,
it was actually quite straightforward. 5's quite a nice natural number for them, really, because it kind of follows it from the start to the end. Not quite the end, because the end of the process is the bit that I still struggle with. I'm very good at getting projects up to about 80% and then getting distracted by something else. But I can help up to that point. So the first tip that I had was to make the thing that you want to have. So I wouldn't ever want to do a design where I was sort of looking at Board Game Geek and seeing, oh, roll and write is really popular right now, I should do a roll and write game. Or say like, oh, this theme, or identifying a gap and saying like, well, no one's ever done this before, I should do that. I think that the most successful things that I've made are games that I want to like play at the table. and that need isn't currently being catered for whatever reason. So Into the Odd being an example, I thought, well, I like all these rules light games, and I like all these games that have a lot of flavor, but there aren't many games that are doing both. They tend to be one or the other. Like, they tend to be just a very generic rules light, clean, elegant system, or this big messy thing, which I can both enjoy in their own way, but could I put them together? And that's what I did.
This is sort of like the advice to just homebrew something.
Yeah, definitely. I think everything should start as a homebrew, really. I think if you go into it looking at it as like making a product, and again, the caveat here is that I am like a professional game designer, believe it or not, for a year, but I understand that if you are working for a large board game producing company, you probably do need to start thinking about products. But if you're just looking at getting into it, then I think yeah, think of it as a homebrew and think about it at your table before you even begin to think about how can I sell this and how can I monetize this thing. Number 2 I had is start with a hack. So, like I said, most of my games start from a place of someone else's game, and I hope nobody else is going to object to this, because I don't object to people using my game as starting points. And there's lots of people that have done that and have taken like Into the Odd and run with it, and they'll tell me like 3 years later, oh, this game was really inspired by Into the Odd, and I'll look through it and I'll think, well, I can't see that because like it changed so much. Like, it's cool. But yeah, if you start with something that is close to what you want, and then make sure that you're changing enough of it that you're not causing problems, basically. Because I think if you do try and start from scratch, you're kind of like reinventing the wheel to some extent. You're trying to like, it's like when I'm going to use a really good analogy here. It's like if you're making, nobody makes puff pastry. Everybody buys a pre-made puff pastry because it's a solved thing. Like, we've sorted it. Like, you go to the supermarket and you buy a block of puff pastry and you roll it out, and then you worry about the filling and stuff. That's fine. Nobody's going to ask, did you make this pastry yourself? And it's not a perfect analogy, because by here, I think you do want to change it up enough that you don't necessarily recognize it from its original source. But yeah, don't worry about creating something from scratch if you can just start with something that already exists.
I think that's really good advice, because when I've thought about this, when I've just dabbled with the idea of these things, it's always just like, yeah, I'd nick that bit from there because that just works, right? I'd nick that combat system or whatever it is, because it's just like, played that seems fun. Yeah, and
chances are when you do put these things together, they probably won't quite work 100%. So you will probably end up changing that thing, and you'll probably change it just enough that it all comes together and feels different. So yeah, I want to make it clear, I'm not just saying like make a hack of an existing system. Like that's the thing, you can do that, or you can just make house rules for something that already exists. But I think a lot of good games do start from that point.
There's a Cole Worley quote that's just engraved in my brain. A little story where he said he was playing, I think it was Ride the Rails or something like that. It was some kind of train game, and he likes to do this thing where he tests games and he plays them for one turn too many. So it takes you again, and so if it's meant to have 5 rounds, play for 6 and see what happens. And the answer is, for most of them, is like they break. Obviously, because they're sort of engines that get really hot. I think that's like a really good place to start, isn't it? Just try and break something.
Yeah, well, that's funny enough. That's my third is to test early, I would say.
I was not supplied these tips beforehand.
Well, no, it's you've got to step further, and like, yeah, test it until it breaks is definitely a good way to go, and like try and break it. But I think I see a lot of people like almost worrying about testing it, and I think as long as you preface, your friends aren't going to want to come around and necessarily just be your like what's the word I'm after?
Like focus group.
Focus group. They don't want to come around and be your focus group like for free, I'm sure. But like, as soon as you get something to a point where you can like literally complete the game, like you've got the sequence to do the turns, and it's going to last this many turns, and this is what you want to do. Just print out a dummy copy and like test it yourself, or test it with, if you've got one person that doesn't mind helping you out, just test it as early as possible, because without fail, the first test always reveals something like massive that I've overlooked. Where you're like, oh yeah, that just completely ruins the entire game. So you need to take that out. And yeah, I think too much. It's easy to think of playtesting like focus groups, where you could think, oh well, if I play test it too much, am I like watering it down and making it like designed by committee sort of thing? But the key thing to remember is, just because you're doing testing and people are telling you things, you don't have to like do everything that people say. As kind of a side note to this, there's a lot of good articles out there about how to do effective playtesting, but the one thing that I really like is telling the people that you're testing very early on, and that they'll still do it, but tell them not to suggest solutions to you. Tell them to only come to you with problems, because I still do this. Like I tested a game with a friend, and he literally sent me like, he was like, oh, you could do it this way. And like we were chatting about it. I was like, oh yeah, that's cool. Some cool ideas. And then like later that day, he sent me like a Word document that was like, oh, you could do this. You could rewrite it this way. And I'm like, you've just designed your own game. Like, just, you go and do that if you want. But I'm not like rewriting my entire game. And like his suggestions were good. But I think for me as a designer, I think it's more useful for you to just tell me like, oh yeah, the end game felt a bit boring. Or you could say, yeah, there was a point where I had 3 options and none of them seemed good and it was a bit frustrating. Like just very straightforward, experiential things. And then you can kind of build a picture and come to your own solutions, I think, is how I prefer to do it. And I think that's perhaps a more effective way than having 6 different people tell you their proposed fixes to the system. And then my 4th pick was something that I like to do a lot, which is limitation breeds creativity. So a good example of this is very often with rules. I wrote kind of like when I started working on games full time, I wrote like I called it a manifesto, which sounds very grand.
I was waiting for that word to slip out.
Some people took it seriously, I think, and I kind of regret it because it makes me sound like a very pompous that I have a manifesto. But that's the problem with like dry humor online, is it doesn't always translate. But the actual content I do agree with. And the thing that I had was if I'm going to find the actual. Yeah, there we go. So one of the limitations that I set for myself is that if everything you need to use at once doesn't fit on a 2-page spread, then it's too complicated. And if a concept can't be expressed as a short set of bullet points, then it's too unfocused. So these are like limitations that I set on myself. Now, I'm not saying these should be like universal rules for every game ever. But for the type of game that I like to make, just by doing that, and often I do try to get all the rules on one page, it does mean you end up chopping a lot of rules out, and it forces you to make every rule has to justify its place. A little bit like I said with that one hour War Games book. One of the reasons I found it really interesting is that he set this really arbitrary limit where for every era there was only going to be 4 different units. So he has to say, like, look, I know that there would have been, I don't know, there might have been heavy cavalry and light cavalry in this time period, but I could only include 1, and here's why, and here's how I represented it. And he's sort of made it work for every era. And it just forces you to get down to what's really important and prioritize, so you haven't got like a muddled game that sort of tries to do everything at once. So yeah, set yourself some limitations, and sort of embrace that kind of challenge, if you like.
Just come back to that particular bit from your very serious manifesto. You definitely didn't mean with any sarcasm. The idea of everything could be expressed in bullet points and simplifying things just sounds good as a reading experience.
Again, I'm such a selfish designer because I'm really bad at reading like paragraphs of text. Like I just can't. I don't know if I'm getting worse as I get older, but like I'll just read a paragraph and then I'll think I haven't taken that in. I've just kind of glossed over that. And I could work on that myself and try and improve my own reading and retention. But I thought, well, there must be other people like me that have this problem and find it kind of hard work to read these big paragraphs of text. So I did kind of design Electric Bastion with those bullet points very selfishly.
We once on Twitter asked, what's the thing you'd improve about rule books or something like that. I think it was James Wallace replied, and he said every game rulebook, including RPGs, could be improved by making it spiral bound and having tabs along the edge, so you can find things quickly while playing. And he's sort of right.
Yeah, I did look at Spiralbound for Electric Bastionland, but the problem that you have is that they're not very sturdy. That's the issue at the moment. So I'm sure there are ways around it. Like you can get like, I can't think what it's called, where it's like almost like a mini ring binder.
Yes. The future of RPGs is full of axes.
Yeah. Oh, that would be ideal. You can like pop them in and out. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's actually a brilliant idea.
Well, I think I think D&D tried that with the Monster Manual in 2nd edition. That was like a ring bound thing, and I don't know whether that got a good response. I think people do, and I'm the same. I think I am drawn to like the big hardback book. It is like a weird thing. So I don't know if someone released a Spiralbound book, would I perhaps feel a little bit?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, you might feel a bit cheap about it. I actually, I totally agree with like the prestige of the big hardback book.
Yeah.
But I do wish nearly all books were slightly smaller.
Yes.
In some way. But it seems to be just an industry standard.
That's it. And the thing is, like, because I did look at softback, but I think hardback is easier to get it to lie flat. Is the defining factor at the end. So, like, when the first thing that I asked the printers so many times before the books were sent was, because there were different types of like binding, and one of them was the lie flat binding, and I was like, I definitely want that one. And I asked so many times, like, can we please make sure that it lies flat? Because I'll be so disappointed if it comes and it's one of these books that just like snaps shut because
folds back up.
Yeah.
Yes. And we've run down a rabbit hole here.
Oh yeah. So I'll get us back on track with our so my final one was to embrace the mutation, is the way that I phrased it.
Embrace the mutation.
What I mean is, I think when you go into creating a game, you might have like a really solid idea of what you want to create, and you might even be able to picture it in your head, like as a finished thing. But as you kind of do play testing and as you pick up other bits of influence as you go, the game is going to shift in ways that you hadn't necessarily expected. And it is going to move away from like that initial idea. And I think that is where a lot of the good things really happen. And that's where you get a lot of these things that kind of grow organically as you're making the game often end up being like the best bits of it, I think. So yeah, I would say rather than trying to like keep on beating yourself up for going off track, I would embrace that mutation as long as you're still happy with the direction that it's going in.
Yeah. As long as it's still the same game.
You're
not suddenly you've started to write naval combat rules in your RPG or whatever.
I don't know. Maybe that's good,
actually. I don't know.
Maybe that's the crossover that's waiting to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that kind of it's the organic nature of it that I think works for me. I think you can sit in a room and try and write a brilliant game, but I think the really good games kind of grow out of that organic thing of like testing it and sort of changing it at the table almost.
Well, thank you very much, Chris.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
For your sage advice, for coming on as well.
I can't guarantee this is great advice, but it's advice I would give myself.
So where can people get Electric Bastionland?
So you can get Electric Bastionland at bastionland.com. It's currently available in hardback and it's on PDF through itch.io and DriveThruRPG as well.
Great. And where can people find you?
So bastionland.com has all of my things, so that's where the blog is. It also has the links to the video content that I do, the podcasts, and the Patreon if you're that way inclined.
Lovely stuff. Well, thank you very much.
No, thank you.